Chapter 1. When I woke up this morning, I could see through my window slit that the winter sky was dark. I dressed in my rough robe and pushed open the door to the long, dim hallway. The stone floor was cold under my bare feet as I walked to the refectory door where the sisters were lined up in their gray habits. We filed in silence as usual, and sat down to a meal of porridge and milk. I stared at the dreary food and listened to today's chosen sister droning a passage from the Bible. Suddenly my mind was flooded with the picture of the banquet my father had given on the occasion of my betrothal. Once more I sat on a high purple cushion in the great dining hall of the palace. The bronze dishes gleamed in the bright torchlight. Servers in multicolored uniforms poured great spouts of red wine into tall goblets. The rich smells of spices and roasted meats filled the room. The guests talked and laughed, teasing me and my betrothed as was the custom. The dogs barked and fought over bones. My mother led the company in singing bridal songs that made me blush, child that I was. The image was so strong that I forgot where I really was and did not realize how hard I gripped my wooden spoon until it broke in my clenched fist. I was confused for a moment to find myself sitting on the hard stone bench in the convent's refectory, with the reading sister hushed into silence, the others looking at me out of the corners of their eyes. The only face turned squarely in my direction was that of the Mother Superior. "Are you troubled, my daughter?" she asked. "Is there something you lack?" "Nothing, Mother," I murmured, and leaned forward to try to eat some of the porridge with what was left of my spoon. She said no more, but after the meal she held me back. "You have seemed dissatisfied of late. Can I do anything to make you more comfortable here?" What could I say? That I was sick to death of the quiet, the dull grayness, the monotony of the days? There was nothing she or I could do to change that. I mentally searched the convent looking for a glint of color, a place of warmth, and suddenly I remembered the scriptorium, the copying room where the little nuns sat hunched over parchment, copying manuscripts in their careful handwriting. They were allowed a little more heat than the rest of the sisters, since frozen hands do not make graceful letters, and some light so that they could see their work clearly. The talented were occasionally allowed a little pigment to adorn a capital letter, and occasionally even some gold leaf to decorate the first page of a manuscript. "I would ask a favor," I replied finally. "My days are long, and I do not have the duties that keep your women occupied. I am skilled at writing, and it would please me to spend a few hours every day assisting your sisters in the copying room." I had already learned that the mother had long trained her face not to show emotion, so I could not tell if she was surprised. She merely replied, "We would be grateful for your assistance, and I would gladly grant you permission, but as you know, I must consult with the Emperor before approving any change in your daily routine." As she said this, I was glad that I was no less disciplined than she, for if my face had shown what I felt, I would have terrified the meek little women still lining the hallway with the sight of the bitter hatred that welled up in me at the mention of my brother. For it is his fault that I am here, his fault that my intelligence and my training are being wasted within these stone walls, his fault that I am not sitting on the high throne as Empress of the Byzantine Empire. For I am Anna Komnena, and I was born in the purple chamber where the heirs to the throne of the most powerful empire in the world first see the light. Chapter 2. After the noon meal today, Mother Superior informed me that she had received word that the Emperor had no objection to my copying manuscripts. He also sent me his prayers, not that I want them. So in the afternoon I left my room and with a little nun as guide, made my way to the scriptorium. This convent is really just a large farmhouse, but it is old, and the wooden floors creak underfoot as you walk. My guide led me down the dark hall. The Mother Superior rarely allows either candles or torches, and the weak winter sun is not enough to illuminate these rooms. Down the hall we went in silence, then up the narrow stairs to the scriptorium, a small room on the corner of the building with window slits facing west and south. What little sun there was shone through more brightly here, and a small fire burned in the hearth. I sat on a vacant stool. As no one paid me the least attention, I had leisure to look around. 4 nuns were perched on high wooden stools, bent over tables littered with paper, inks, pens, and short knives. Their sleeves were rolled up for greater ease in writing. Since they usually hide their hands in their wide sleeves, I was almost startled to see that they indeed had hands and wrists. I could not see their faces, and only occasionally would one shift position, heave a sigh, or rub her fingers, which must have been cramped from the work. A young novice in a white robe darted from one to the other, filling inkpots, sharpening pens, cleaning brushes, all without saying a word. I wondered how she knew which sister needed attention. For 2 hours I sat on a hard stool, hands folded on my lap, waiting for Sister Thecla, who was in charge of the scriptorium, to assign me a task. This sister walked up and down in front of the tables, occasionally pointing at something on a page without saying a word. The nun whose paper had been indicated would nod, then reach for the sharp knife kept handy to scrape off mistakes. I had never spoken to Sister Thecla, but had ample opportunity to observe her as she walked up and down, pretending not to notice my existence. She She is short and plain, with a mustache and eyebrows that meet above her nose. She was evidently pleased to be able to make an imperial princess wait for her convenience. But I am patient. I know how to wait. I started learning patience before I was born. As a child, I often heard my mother tell the story of my birth. 2 days before I was born in the year of our Lord, 1083, my mother, the Empress Irene Duquesne, felt me stirring in her belly and was worried that I would appear before my father came home from war. So she made the sign of the cross over me where I lay in her belly and said, "Wait, little one, until your father returns." Her mother told her she was being foolish, for what if my father were delayed for a month or more? Could she bear the pangs of labor that long? But fortunately for both of us, just 2 days later the emperor returned in triumph, and I was born in the great bedchamber hung with imperial purple, where all children of the emperor come into the world. Now, I told myself, if I can wait 2 days to be born out of respect for my mother's wishes, surely I can wait a few hours while a homely nun pretends to ignore me as I sit quietly on a stool. I did not much mind the wait in any case. It was good to smell the ink and hear the scratching of pens once more. I have always loved learning, and as a child was the prize pupil of the imperial tutor and librarian, the eunuch Simon, a small man with no hair and a round belly. When he discovered my passion for the chronicles of our ancestors, he set me to memorizing large portions of the Iliad. "You can learn everything you need to know about life from this book, little beetle," he said to me. "It's all there. Love, hatred, life, death, immortality, everything you humans find important." "We humans? But surely you are human too, Simon." "Not really. Not anymore," he said. "A slave is not a human being, princess. Or were you not aware of that?" I didn't like it when he talked like that. Father Agathis said we should all be content to be where God had placed us. I had been born in the purple, and I was to marry the man that my father had chosen as his heir, so I would be the next empress. Simon had been born the son of a schoolmaster in a village that had revolted against the rule of my father's family, the Comneni, so he and his family became slaves. According to Father Agathis, this was logical, and a good instance of God's plan, for how could I be empress if there were no slaves? For me to fulfill my destiny, Simon had to fulfill his. I accepted this without question, as my mother had told me that Father Agathis was very wise, but it still made me uneasy. My memories of Simon were interrupted by Sister Thecla, who suddenly appeared before me and glowered into my face. When I looked up at her, she turned on her heel and marched down to the end of one of the copy desks. I assumed I was to follow, although at another time in my life a common woman who turned her back on me would have been instantly banished from the empire. But I care for these forms no longer, and followed her to the place that had been recently vacated by one of the nun scribes. Sister Thecla nodded to the little novice, who scurried up to my spot with a pen, a bottle of thin black ink, and a piece of parchment that had been used and reused so many times that the constant scraping had worn it almost away. Sister Thecla pointed to the top of the page and said, "Alpha." She then turned on her heel and marched away once again. I burned. She had set me the most elementary writing task, one that I had accomplished with skill and ease at the age of 5. Yet if she wanted rows of the letter alpha, the first letter of the alphabet, alpha she would get. As I clenched the pen, thinking how to begin, the novice appeared at my side. In front of me she placed a straight piece of wood and a pointed stick. These were for me to make straight lines across the paper, pressing the point of the stick into the paper to make a dent that would gradually disappear after I had written. As I reached for them, the girl gave me a shy smile, blinking at me with lashless eyes above a pink nose that ran. I did not return her smile. Did she not know who I was? Who was she to offer friendship to me? After all, I had learned what friendship meant and did not trust it anymore. For an hour I sat at my bench making rows of alphas. The first ones were simple, like those of a child, but I gradually embellished them, adorning them with curlicues and extravagant ornamentation. By the time I got to the bottom of the page, a reader could hardly tell what letter he was looking at, so hidden in the depth of the flourishes was the original alpha. When I finally realized that I was cold and looked up, I saw that I was alone but for Sister Thecla, who was seated at the end of the room. The other sisters had slipped out while I was working, and the small fire was reduced to embers and ashes. Not wanting to carry my work to the nun like a small child to her teacher, I folded my hands in my lap and stared straight ahead. Sister Thecla also sat with her hands in her lap, although she looked down at them and not at me. I could see her fingers moving over the beads of her rosary as her lips moved in prayer. In silence we waited. I could tell that the sun was sinking ever lower as the room grew darker and chillier. I was glad of my woolen cloak and wondered how the nun was standing the cold on her stone perch. Longer and longer we waited. I grew hungry and started to feel the need to visit the privy. Still we waited. At last I heard the convent bell begin to toll. I knew that Sister Thecla had to present herself at prayers, and that the Mother Superior was expecting to hear how I had performed at my task. Sister Thecla knew it too, and finally rose to her feet and came in my direction. She bent her head and looked at my writing. Without glancing at me or saying a word, she nodded, turned, and left the room. I sat for another minute so as not to follow Sister Thecla too closely, and then as I walked down the now black corridor, I almost laughed out loud. I had triumphed indeed, but what a triumph! The nun had tried to humiliate me even further than I had already been humiliated, and I had resisted. But what an enemy on whom to practice my long-studied arts of diplomacy and cunning. I should have been dealing with a foreign prince, a bishop, a sultan, not with a little woman of no importance save in her own small world. How had I fallen so far? Why were my feet not ringing on the polished marble floors of the palace in Constantinople? Why were servants not running to bring me delicate foods, to light a roaring fire in a tapestry-hung hall? Why were my feet covered with coarse shoes instead of silk slippers, and my hair gathered up in a loose knot, instead of woven into complicated braids and lightly padded with perfume? A small voice kept saying in time to my footsteps, "You did it to yourself, yourself, yourself. You did it to yourself, yourself, yourself." But I hushed it. If I had succeeded, if my mother and I had managed to accomplish what we had set out to do, if we had not been betrayed by those we most trusted, I would now be seated next to my husband in the imperial throne room, and that small, ugly man who calls himself the emperor and my brother would be buried in the cold, dark ground of Constantinople.